and painted a rosy picture of his country. As a paragon of solidarity, democracy, and human rights. On behalf of the U.S. mission to the United Nations, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the UN and the ECOSOC chamber. A few weeks ago, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel came here to the United Nations and painted a rosy picture of his country. As a paragon of solidarity, democracy, and human rights. To the more than 5,000 Cubans who were arbitrarily detained for political reasons in 2017, this is a sick joke. More and more, Cuban repression relies on raids of activists' homes and offices, short-term detentions, and public denunciations known as repudio, which I think is what we may be seeing right now. And while we found some hope in the private homes that have been converted into small restaurants, what is security doing here? You just press the button, but her microphone's not on. Her microphone is on. Don't, it's okay. In the small restaurants that have been made, and private homes that have been turned into small restaurants, and from the artists selling their wares in the square, underneath that hope remained fear. The artist who would not mention Fidel Castro by name, the mother of a disappeared young man who despaired of ever finding out what happened to her son, the doctor who looked nervously at government minders, like my friends here in the room, when we asked him questions. Today, 20 years after my visit, the situation remains dire, especially for those who disagree with this regime, as we can see. Most of the dissidents and human rights activists I met are either dead or killed by the regime, or have spent most of the past 20 years in jail. Reputable NGOs report that more than 100 Cubans currently languish in jails or under house arrest as political prisoners. In one particularly ludicrous case, the Cuban authorities charged independent journalist Yoenis de Jesus Guerra Garcia with illegally slaughtering livestock, thus proving that despite its avowed atheism, the Cuban Communist Party still considers itself the ultimate sacred cow. As we sit here today, can you please remove them from the room? I'm going to pause while security removes the disruptive elements from the room. Nick, can you please ask Nick to remove them from the room? Or exercise their freedom of expression as guaranteed by the Cuban Constitution. political prisoners are a clear and unambiguous sign of the repressive nature of the regime. Their imprisonment represents a blatant affront to the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. President Trump is taking action to hold the Cuban regime responsible for its human rights violations and supporting the Cuban people's aspirations to live in freedom. Today, we come to the United Nations to remind the world that today, in Cuba, there are political prisoners. They are united in their quest to speak out for a better, freer, and more democratic Cuba, for themselves, for their children, even for the people in this room who persist in disrupting this event. And their imprisonment is not only a violation of the fundamental freedoms we all cherish, it is also a human tragedy. We are grateful for the participation today of OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro, who has championed the cause of democracy and human rights throughout the Americas, including for Cuba's political prisoners. We welcome Carlos Quezada, a civil society activist whose organization works side by side with activists in Cuba and other Latin American nations to enhance their ability to promote and protect the human rights of marginalized and vulnerable people, whose brother Eduardo is currently serving a 3-year sentence in a Cuban jail. Eduardo is a leader in the Christian liberation movement, which criticized Fidel Castro in November 2016. Several days later, he was arrested. The witnesses at the scene say authorities beat him during his arrest. It was Carde who was sentenced to her assault. The Presas Para Qué, or Jailed for What campaign seeks to draw attention to the cases of specific political prisoners.
I think we're getting a good demonstration of the respect for freedom of expression that exists. This is a kickoff for a campaign called Jailed for What? And our aim is to spotlight the people who are in prison in Cuba for doing nothing more than what we're trying to do today, which is speaking calmly and peacefully. Yeah, put earphones on and you can hear. If the audience who would like to hear what's going on up here would put their earphones on, you'll be better able to hear over all this foolishness. Let's just continue. I would like to recognize our ambassador to the Organization of American States, Carlos Trujillo, who is here today. The Chief of Staff of Secretary General Almagro, Gonzalo Quanque, is here today. We will turn it over to the Secretary General to make remarks.
It's been a long time since the Cuban regime has actually used strategies to silence in a systematic way all of those who dare express opinions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. And I want to thank the Cuban delegation again for giving us such a graphic demonstration of how they deal with alternative viewpoints in their country.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I would like to thank the UN mission for organizing this important event and inviting us here. Independent journalists and any other person who expresses opinions against the government. This is possible in part because the provisions of criminal and criminal procedure laws and respectful conditions to people deprived of their liberty. Use of the criminal code to criminalize activists. The criminal code is the main tool by Cuban authorities to silence persons who express opinions against the government. Being detained by 2 police officers and approached the police officer and asked him why his friend was being detained. One of the officers pushed him and then he was forced into a police car and kept in detention and is currently serving a nearly 5-year prison sentence under difficult circumstances. In another case, the lady in white, Marta Sanchez, was convicted in September of desacato and other crimes after peacefully protesting the electoral system in Cuba. She is currently serving a 4-year, 6-month sentence. She was detained for 7 months before she was tried and convicted. Marta Sanchez was targeted because of her active role as a member of the Ladies in White. Atentado. The crime used the most to target activists is atentado, or assault of authority, defined in Article 142 of the Penal Code. Under the Penal Code, atentado occurs when a person employs violence or intimidation against an authority, a public officer, or their agents or assistants to impede the performance and act.
At this point, I would like to turn over the floor to someone who knows firsthand what it's like to be a political prisoner in Cuba. Alejandro Gonzalez Raga was one of 75 journalists, human rights activists, and librarians arrested in 2003 in Cuba's Black Spring. He was charged with acts against the independence and territorial integrity of the state and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was released and exiled to Spain in 2008. And he's traveled here today from Madrid to be with us. Alejandro, thanks so much for your presence and for your continued activism on behalf of your jailed compatriots.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I am very grateful for this opportunity that implies great responsibility because it is impossible for my testimony to really delve in depth campaign. Thank you very much.
Una cosa.
Just one more thing. People can see here what I'm capable of doing in a body like this. You don't know what they do in Cuba. That's the end of everything, yeah.
Miriam was going to be with us today physically, but the Cuban government blocked her from traveling.
Miriam Cardet Concepcion here. I am Eduardo Cardet Concepcion's sister, who is a political prisoner in Cuba.
We wanted to provide a few minutes for questions from the floor, but I'm beginning to think that may not be the easiest thing to do, given our activities in the room. You can imagine what it's like in Cuba. If this is the way the government of Cuba behaves in the chambers of the United Nations with security present and so on, can you imagine what it would be like to be an individual Cuban citizen trying to speak their mind with this kind of attitude towards them? Our friends here can't seem to stop long enough to say goodbye. It is, I was ready to end the proceedings, but I'm damned if I'm going to do it for you. So I can sit here all day and let you shout yourself silly. I want to thank our guests for coming, and I once again want to thank the Cuban delegation for demonstrating exactly what we were talking about. They've given you a better a demonstration of their respect for freedom of expression than anything we could have said. You know, you can shout yourself silly, but it's not going to change anything. I think we're approaching the time we have the room, but we'll sit here until that time comes. Now reaching the time when we will have to vacate the room because we had it for the hour. I want to again thank you all for coming, and we will publish the presentations of our panelists. And thank you again to the Cuban side for being so endlessly demonstrative of how they behave. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.